Hello and welcome to Film 2231, Indigenous Film. And in today's lecture, we're going to talk about the importance of memory and remembrance in Indigenous cinema. The image that you see in this slide is taken from the cover of The Fighting Trapper in 1874, and I took it from a book by Thomas King called The Inconvenient Indian. And at this point, the writer was talking about the sentiment of let's ignore the past and enjoy the present. The idea that this is great to from now on just enjoy and forget about the past. History of humankind was the history of violence. Happened in Germany. It happened in Japan. And you can see these two countries have reconciled themselves in the Western democratic world. So this sentiment that uh, the indigenous activists should stop. I'm going to talk about why this is not as easy as it sounds. First of all, note that actually the indigenous people in Canada do not want to assimilate or participate in the economy of the countries. And actually, they have done uh, fine so far. There were like cops, teachers, judges, writers, musicians, and so on. So the question of assimilation is not really relevant here. What's important here is that the indigenous history has always been neglected systematically. Unlike the examples that I gave, like Germany or even African American in USA, for example, there were always Holocaust museums or museums about the wrongdoings of the past in the United States with regard to of the lynching practices and the history of slavery. In Canada, all anthropological museums still they are interested in the artifacts, not really the history of genocides or residential schools. Like there are a number of museums like anthropological museums in Canada, such as Museum of Civilization, but it's not really similar to something like a Holocaust museum. In a way, that history has always been ignored, and more importantly, is always shown as an ancient past, not a continuous history. Not that people right now people in the indigenous communities are not relevant or their problems are not the problems of the past or there is no correlation between them. For example, again, the idea of alcoholism, all these things are being stereotypically portrayed. So it's always we have this image of a drunk Indian man in from like the late 18th century, and usually you don't see that in the media to be represented in the same way for white um, drinking problems. But what is important again is that like issues such as land claims, treaties, again the abuse in the past is always shown as not really something that um, is directly related to the policies of the past. For example, like I was reading an article that even the problem of obesity and high number of diabetes cases among indigenous population in Canada is caused by certain policies that Canadian government took with regards to the residential school system. So here, remembrance is not really about a nostalgia or victimization or anything. It's a political act. Here, like memory is something collective, and for that reason, it's a highly politicized phenomenon. So this cultural memory, cultural collective memory, becomes a means for resisting against certain cultural genocide. The idea of forgetting, this idea of promoting forgetfulness about what has happened in the past. And one tool for building this cultural memory is cinema. The question of memory and remembrance is very important for the film that has been assigned for today, Rhymes for the Young Goals. But this remembrance, sometimes flashbacks, sometimes quick ones, like psychological flashbacks, you can see in many films done by Indigenous directors, like the one we watched a couple of weeks ago, Smoke Signals. There's a recent science fiction film called Parallel Minds. I think it was made in 2019 that kind of, again, in an interesting way, the movie recalls the experience of um, elderly members of Indigenous communities in Canadian residential schools. Also, we have similar policies in New Zealand and Australia. So films like Rabbit Proof, for instance, in a similar way, they deal with this topic of reconstructing the past. Attending residential school system was becoming compulsory after the 1950s, but the emergence of such schools goes back to 1804. And there are estimates that about 150,000 kids were attended these schools in Canada. There were diseases like tuberculosis, and later in the 1918 and after, there was Spanish flu, malnutrition, and more than that, there were official reports of physical, mental, health, and sexual abuse. Children were taken from their families. The whole idea was to offer them the so-called white values instead of their own cultural heritage. For that reason, there were not many visits by the families to the residential schools. The irony, however, is that Indigenous people were never really resistance of the idea of standard education. Unlike the stereotypical idea that their society is built on their superficial legend and ideas of spiritualism, they did not have any problem with science and also the some sort of a standard education of science and education in English. But what was taught in these schools were Christian values and working in farms, both of them alien to native cultures in Canada. As again, Thomas King suggests, why in the name of education they had to give up everything they had? They had to be stripped of their culture, making North American white values superior to native ceremonies and cultural values. And there are evidences that, in terms of health conditions and nutrition, the services were substandard. What you see in the film this week, actually, some of these issues, for example, these young characters were actually very good with technical stuff, with a pipeline and timing, how to work the infrastructure of the residential. These schools for the children and even for their families was kind of a death trap, and it's a national tragedy. It's Canada's dark past. And for this reason, Prime Minister Stephen Harper in 2009 apologized in the House of Commons. The reading that has been assigned for this week uses Gilles Deleuze's ideas of counter dreaming. It's okay if you do not have a background in Deleuzean philosophy and his works on cinema, but Caitlin Doyle offers a radical interpretations of Jeff Barnaby's films Rhymes for Young Girls, in that the film provides an opportunity to escape the dream of others, the dream of colonizers. When, for example, their relationship with money is different, and it's been explained in the reading, or the scenes that we watch the dead mother from different perspectives, sometimes with perspective of the colonizers and the perspective of the community and how they are different. So it's some sort of a resistance to the idea of forgetting the past, the idea of reconciliation and mutual respect. The film does not reduce Indigenous people to mere victims of the society that now should be taken care of. Counter dreaming offers rather an alternative to the idea of achieving inclusion with the dominant society. The mask, for example, in this image, is shown as a form of resistance to this idea of forgetting. So while watching this film for this week, please pay attention to how the protagonist has been depicted and her dream, and how she creates a new memory, and that new memory works for the community as a form of resistance, a powerful tool to resist the dream of colonizer instead of adapting themselves with the dominant ideologies, or showing themselves as the victim of that ideology, how that sort of counter dreaming works as a form of resistance.
Rule number 2, stay out of debt. Indians can't understand debt, don't get money. Indian agents don't speak Indian. They speak money. They speak it with their boots. They speak it with their fists. They speak it with their blood and bats. Rule number 3, take care of your family.
You know, this isn't about the money. Turner's always late with that.
You can think of how the movie is relevant to both indigenous and non-indigenous audiences. How non indigenous audiences would be educated by this film.